Hello once again, it's your host here with the Rhetoric Review, and today we're back for the second episode of this podcast video essay style channel. So today I'm going to be discussing a novel idea that I've come up with. So it's obviously borrowed from contemporary ideas and ideas of the past, but mostly this is something that I'm trying to propose, and it'll be seen in section 5, relative history. So I'm going to walk through 2, 3, 4, linear model, new progress, and thought progression, all of which contribute to understanding what relative history means and how that impacts you today. So to start, I'm going to go through what the linear model of history is. Now, I can personally attest to this when I say that when history is taught in middle school, high school, elementary school even, you're going to find that history is approached as we do something, let's fix. What's that one adage you always hear? That history, we learn history so we don't repeat it. Mark Twain famously said, apparently, many quotes are attributed to Mark Twain, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So, what does this mean? A way to interpret this idea that we need to learn history so it doesn't repeat itself is that we have been doing that actively. Right? There's no blatant examples other than, of course, Russia with Napoleon and Hitler, obviously. But there's no great example of history truly repeating itself. And what that leads you to think as just a normal citizen, as a scholar, or as a student, is that history is linear. That history moves in the direction of good and progress. Now this is true to many degrees, as humanity has definitely evolved over the last few millennium. But people always say that there have been tipping points in this quote unquote linear model of history. What are these tipping points? Well, we'll get into that right now. So here's an example. I took this from a Twitter X user, and this more or less describes the Eurocentric view of history as a linear progressive model. So you'll see it starts with, of course, the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, all the way until the modern era, which is the post-Cold War American-led Pax Americana, if you will, which is where America controls the Navy and the seas and ensures free trade. Point is, you're going to find that through this model, everything is good, everything's linear, everything is in the name of progress. However, many people have found that accurately that this isn't always the case. History is not always a forward-moving vector, if that's a good way to put it. History has its dips. Case in point, you have the Black Death, circa 1300s, where almost, I believe, a third of Europe died, succumbed to disease, and although it did set the stage for the Renaissance, had, catastrophic collapse of population for Europe. Similarly, you'll have the secular ideologies of the 20th century. This is, you have, communism, or I guess Stalin style communism. You have Maoism, which I guess is Mao style communism. But these secular ideologies also resulted in huge losses. And these times, the Holodomor in Ukraine, which is a huge I guess man-made famine sort of in during the Soviet Union's time, and the Great Leap Forward in China, where millions of people died due to collectivization, which we could go into here, but I don't think it's important. Point is, a lot of bad things happened in throughout history, and you'll find that there's people, cynics on the internet especially, that find that due to these issues, the linear progressive model of history must be wrong or the successive. The fault behind this is, yes, they're right. It is wrong. But you need to approach history in a certain way, which is that history moves with time, right? Time is linear. And therefore, so must be progress. And that is the first idea I propose, which is the new progress. What is the new progress then? Okay, new progress says that everything that has happened in history is progression and is therefore productive. I'm not going to say good, but productive because it happened in the past. That is to say, you can't judge a historical events on its importance, or you can't wish it to go away because of its subsequent lessons that humanity has learned, and the fact that it's not happening right now. For example, the fact that World War II happened in 1945, or the world population was billions less, is an objective good. I'm gonna say good here because it's not happening today. If World War II or an equivalent of World War III were to happen in today's world in 2025, millions more would die, billions even, who knows. And from a pure utilitarian perspective, right, where you want to minimize human suffering, that's not a good thing. And it might seem a bit difficult to fully grasp, but New Progress basically says that things in the past are productive because of the very nature that they were in the past. This really isn't saying much that changes anything, but it's a necessary way to view history that allows for the final point to be made about relative history, which, like the last video, is going to be based around technological developments and how that impacts us as humans. So now we're going to move on to the progression of thought, which is, as I just described, the 3 stages of thinking you might go through. So the very elementary level is the successive or progressive linear model of history. As we just described in the last figure, this is where, at least in the Eurocentric way, you begin in the ancients and you progress in a linear way where things improving every time or at any certain point until modernity. And then you have the holistic model of history, which is what many people choose to believe, or at least abide by, when trying to compare or contrast against the successive linear model of history. This is when you begin to understand that maybe history isn't always good things, and there are bad things happen. And finally, there's the compounding linear model of history, which is partly what New Progress is. That's what I'm trying to propose here. New Progress means that everything in history is essentially still successive. So you're kind of going back to the original idea of linear model, and the compounding linear model says that everything in history is productive and everything is, in fact, linear because it compounds upon itself and builds on previous historical events. So case in point, as I mentioned earlier, would be the Black Death. Millions of people died. Famine was rampant, obviously, because there's no one to farm anymore. People died in the streets of rats, etc. Rats trying to eat rats, being eaten by rats, starvation, disease itself, poverty. All of these things that are negative were productive because, by all significant metrics, Europe, at least Britain's population centers, urban centers at least, were very, very overpopulated, which led to the disease in the first place, but which also had the economic effect, as David, oh my god, I forgot his name. Fisher, yeah, Hackett Fisher, David Hackett Fisher, I believe, said in his book Great Waves that overpopulation in these overpopulation leads to low wages, which leads to greater inequality, which means that less can be done overall economically. The Black Death was a disease, a pandemic, a plague that reset this process and allowed for Britain, France, all these different countries, Italy even, to reset its population and prime itself for the beginning of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was an objective good. Whether you like humanism or not, whether you like all the moral outgrowths, Renaissance set the stage for modernity, which has objectively saved the lives of hundreds of millions at the expense, of course, of wars, social pandemics, whatever. But we have created so much more that has created so much more prosperity for the average person, which someone who might have been a peasant in 1850, right? So that is to say that history is linear. Everything builds on everything else before it. There are no true dark ages, dark periods, because every dark period, quote unquote dark period, I guess I'm contradicting my, every quote unquote dark period directly contributes to a future good. Hopefully, we won't have to go back on this, but the horrors of mass communism, especially at a scale of China and Russia, are never to be repeated again at the same level due to its previous lack of success. So, while many people might claim that the successive linear model of history is wrong and elementary, and that they subscribe to the holistic model of history, which says that history as in like important events, goes up and down, you'll find that once you fully understand the once you fully ascribe important events to the linear passage of time, that ultimately you go back to a linear model. And that goes into my initial point about thought, relative history. So we've gone over linear model, new progress, and then the thought progression that is involved when you go through these problems. So next we're going to go through relative history. So relative history is essentially a correlation between technology and experience history. That is to say, history means important events. So what constitutes an important event? Good question. Important events might be wars, and throughout the lot of history, it has been wars, pandemics, things that regulate human population. However, as you know, we talked about in the last video, but a lot of that has been solved now. Wars have been virtually eliminated, at least ones that kill millions and millions of people, and disease has mostly been eradicated, such that other than genetics-based diseases, there are no global pandemics or anything like that that can actually cut down population. So what constitutes an important event today might be different from what constituted an important event to that society 900 years ago. What constituted an important social event, which might lead into something else, could be the Copernican revolution. If you go back to, I believe, 1490s, when Copernicus upset the world by proposing his heliocentric model of the universe or the solar system. Regardless, something similar might happen now. For example, the internet is a different way of altering society and changing social norms, social expectations, and upsetting the balance of previously existing human societies. So what constitutes an important event is sort of arbitrary, but there's a general feel for what will impact stuff in the future. For example, the arrival of ChatGPT might seem more technological and innovative, but it's very clear that AI will have greater social effects than technical or machine related. So on the top here, you have a graph from sociostudies.org, which draws a correlation between important technological growth aggregated against time. This starts from a few centuries ago and leads eventually until roughly the modern ages, around 1900, when the Industrial Revolution started. Of course, one can imagine that ever since then, it's only accelerated even more, as tools such as the computer circa 1940, internet 1990, and AI 2020, 2021, you're going to find that there's more tools that are built for making even more tools, which will only accelerate our current pace of technological inventions. And to that point, Ray Kurzweil, who is a futurist, innovator, and author, wrote in his book The Singularity is Near in 2005, predicted that the 21st century will be an age of mass AI singularity by 2050, which is actually a number being used right now to predict singularity, which is when basically when AI outpaces humanity. And from this time, he developed the law of accelerating return. So Kurzweil's law of accelerating returns suggests that the next few decades will witness technological advancements equivalent to what previously took centuries. Key point is what previously took centuries. So based on this law, which is in 2005, and it's clearly coming to fruition now, you're going to find that, yes, this is mostly been true. Obviously, it's not been purely exponential and hasn't affected every sector. But if you aggregate all of the total innovation and technological changes that have been happening and social changes, you're going to find that this is mostly true. And this leads into the main point of relative history. So now that we've established that, yes, in fact, recent times have had outsized or outstanding technological innovation, we can make that comparison relatively to history on whole. So we have here a two different models of absolute progression and relative progression. So absolute progression assumes that history is linear and always that history moves on and the same events happen regardless of any minor or major technological development that isn't obviously the cause of the catalyst for history. For example, you would consider the Cold War non-absolute because it was a direct result of there being the nuclear missiles, which directly affected policy, which directly affected proxy wars. So this would be an example of the absolute progression model not being true. So the absolute progression model says, in the case where technology is on the rise at an exponential level, as seen in the last model, then you're going to find that relative security increases. So why is this the case? So history happens due to technology as much as technology is innovated due to history. So, for example, the World Wide Web was initially discovered or made by at MIT, I believe, as a reaction to the Cold War. But then the internet had so much more to do with changing society, not militarily, but mainly, of course, militarily as well, but mainly sociologically. So that's an example of where history is directly influenced by technology. And thus, it can be assumed at the current rate we are due for. Yeah. So based on what history says, and again, like the last models, as the last model showed, excuse me, you're going to find that as technological progress increases, the rate of massive events is going to increase as well. At the very peak of 1900s, what was the two biggest events? Objectively, World War I and World War II. Those were directly World War I more so than World War II, but directly due to massive technological advances. For example, war had to be fought in a different way, which affected policy, which affected the how many soldiers you had to send out, all of these things, right? So this leads into a tech history and relative security graph. So I wrote down something that I'm going to read out, which says, if history is linear, irrespective of technology, then faster technology should result in a relative slowing of history. So this might not make a lot of sense, but I'll illustrate it with an analogy. But first, if you have any understanding of Einstein's laws of relativity, you'll understand generally what this means. So let's say you have two slip and slides, or at a water park, you're going down a slide or whatever, side by side. In the absolute progression model, technology, let's say you're a big guy, you're going really fast. History, thus, let's say it's linear. History is linear. So history is just, your baseline person. You go at a steady rate. History is still moving at one rate. But because technology is moving faster, you get the impression that history is moving slower, that important events are happening less. And therefore, because you believe that big things like wars aren't going to happen, your relative security increases. On the other hand, what I propose is the relative progression model, which has a direct correlation between technology and history, which, if I had more time and research, I could probably figure out the direct correlation, by some historical aggregate, but says that that both history and technology are tied together in a way that if technology's innovation rate increases at a certain way, like the previous figure had shown, history or important events that are occurring will also exceed itself in speed. History will match technology as technology has a direct impact on history, and vice versa. And what this creates, in a general sense, is less relative security. The faster you perceive things to be moving, the less security you have, because obviously instability is bound to happen. A lot of people I know personally, for example, in today's world, is genuinely worried about World War III, especially for fighting age young men who are only a few months, years older than myself at this point. And this is because as AI, for example, AI would be a great example for this. AI has ramped up the already existing and pretty tense sort of Cold War of trade between China and America. So what this might set off is future issues with Taiwan, with America domestically, China domestically, you're gonna find that semiconductors might become the new bargaining chip. They might not be. Energy might become the new bargaining chip. Whatever it is, the development of AI has rapidly progressed the current rate of important events because it necessitates more things, different trade routes, and that has decreased relative security as more people are wary of the future. And the common equation here, which I can relate to my last video, is that the catalyst for all of this is technological development. While in the past, perhaps, the government might have issued a company to make X technology to pursue X means, in today's world, you're not serving a government, you're not serving a legitimate historical need, but you're rather serving the shareholder interest, right? If you're part of a company that makes stuff like, for example, Meta for the consumer good, you're not bound by any history. History is not the catalyst for your innovation. Therefore, technology is independent of history, and history is the dependent variable. That is to say, technology in today's world, in modernity post-Cold War, is rapidly increasing as a direct consequence of technology for technology's sake. Technology is increasing because technology is good and technology is popular, right? Whether that's through computers or a new dish soap, whatever it may be, the more we innovate, eventually there's going to be an aggregated total increase in relative history experience. This means that you're experiencing more history relative to the amount of technology you're getting. So that is to say, should we roll back on technological development for more relative security? Yes. Is that possible? No. If you want to see more about why that's true, you could go to my last video on episode 1 about why history necessitates the current, ongoing infinite expansion of technology. But this model is interesting to me because what this shows is that we're due for something big. In the 20th century, as you saw in, I believe, figure 3, yes, this was up to the 1900s, this above graph, and you're going to find that with the development of so many new military technologies like chemical weapons, machine guns, tanks even, all these countries were eager to use their weapons, their new technologies, and this created huge waves in the world as the First World War ever happened. But in this age, we don't seem to be due for a war. We seem to be due for something else. And what is that something else? We have had so much happen over the last 20 years without any severe consequences. We've had the development of social media, which has severely deprecated the mental health of teenagers, adults, I guess what we would call millennials now. You've had the development of AI in the last 5 years, or at least like large language models, which are able to essentially serve as humans. And in the future, who knows what's going to happen? And you've had the development of, mass psychosis through mental illness, right? Not saying any names here, but you've had all these things crop up, which may or may not be due to the current trend I'm describing of relative history. Internet was developed as a meager little experiment to fight against the Russians informationally in the 1980s, 1990s. However, it's influenced so much more. It's fastened the pace of history. The important events we see right now aren't going to be necessarily World War III. Hell, World War III might never happen. It might not happen at all. But we are due for something big. If the early 20th century was World War I and World War II to be believed, the current rate of historical change and technological change means that we're due for some sort of crisis. And what is this crisis? We don't know. I personally believe it's going to be something more deep and slow moving. It's going to be a direct consequence of Generation Alpha, Generation Z, being unable to process the real world due to mass socialization and, the iPad kids, if you will, and all of these things that will contribute to issues down the line. So, to summarize, the linear model of history purports a constant seam of progress. The new model, or new progress that I'm proposing, has a compounding linear model of history, which means that, yes, it's linear, but it's more linear in the sense that bad things aren't bad things, because bad things are necessary for better things to happen. That might not make sense at all. But going back to my example, Black Death equals Renaissance equals scientific revolution 200 years later, which leads to science and medicine and babies not dying at 80% rates. Next, you're going to have the relative model of history, or relative history, which essentially says that technology directly influences the rate at which important events occur. And while this might seem evident, this is different than in the past, because in the 21st century, and especially after the post-Cold War era, you're going to find that companies and innovators don't innovate for a historical purpose like winning a war. Rather, they innovate for innovation's purpose, which is in the capitalist free market. Therefore, the current rate of history that is being influenced by the current rate of technology means that we're due for some sort of issue that's going to drop relative security further than it is already low right now. It's going to create some sort of deep, lasting effect, which might manifest itself in a crisis of the 21st century or the 22nd century. So, I don't want to be too negative here, but I hope this kind of brought light to what might be happening as a consequence to AI and internet, and how you might be able to think about these in a historical lens that also collides with today's modern world. Thank you, and it's been the Rhetoric Reviewed. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or critiques about today's discussion, please leave it down below. And thank you, and it's Rhetoric Reviewed.